Hello, welcome to the 10th in our series of lectures on business ethics. This set of lectures is going to be on autonomy and issues of privacy. And the first topic I want to deal with is the notion of a moral agent. What is it to be a moral agent? At the end of this lecture, I'd like you to have some understanding of what's involved in being a moral agent, and also to have started to think about the notion of the question of whether a business corporation, which is not a person, right? It's not a human being, can be a moral agent and hence held morally accountable. To remind you, we've seen these definitions before, but a moral agent is someone or something who does things. They're an agent, and we're prepared to assign praise or blame and hold them morally accountable. And to do that, they have to be able to understand moral reasons and respond to those things. So that's a moral agent. Moral agents can be held morally accountable when we should praise them or blame them for their freely made decisions and for the results of those decisions. Okay, so that's what we talked about in the last week in the last set of lectures. And these contrast with the more passive notion of having moral standing. Remember, a moral agent is someone who does things. A person, organization, or even a non-human entity has moral standing, or sometimes it's said to be morally considerable if you have to consider its interests in making an ethical decision. But that's a sort of passive role. Something is done to the person or whatever with moral standing. And we have considerations of whose interests should be considered in ethical decisions. Now this all goes back to this original diagram. This is the organizing diagram really of this whole set of lectures, is that an ethically problematic situation consists of someone, an agent, deciding to do something which has a certain outcome. The questions, when we judge the agent, we look at their character or whatever, to see what sort of person they are. When we think about their decisions, we think about what principles or what they're following or what motivations they have. And when we think about the results, we think in terms of the consequences, the utilitarian considerations about who they help and who they harm. But the other set of questions to ask about agents is this agent really an agent? Does the agent have moral agency? Most adult human beings have moral agency. Most babies do not. A baby's not a moral agent, right? Somewhere along the line, a baby turns into an adult with moral agency. The question we dealt with in the last week was this notion of moral accountability. Under what conditions and how should we hold someone accountable for what they have done? Should we praise them because they've done something well? Should Amy get a bonus because of the decision she helped make? Or should we blame someone? Should we blame Amy for the disaster in the factory in Bangladesh? And so that's moral accountability and moral standing, which we're going to talk about. Maybe we talked about briefly last time. We talked about both of these briefly last time. So these are done. Is this idea of whose interests have to be considered in a moral decision? Should we just consider the owner? Should we consider ourselves and the employees? Or should we include the environment in a more comprehensive view? But this in this week, in this segment, we're going to talk about moral agency, some of the conditions of moral agency, and some of the excusing conditions that stop a person being a moral agent. So there's various ways to think of moral agency, but I'm going to suggest to you that a moral agent has to have at least these following three properties. To have moral agency, someone or something has to have moral perception, they have to have decision-making ability, and they have to have a certain responsiveness to ethical reasons. Okay, let me go through these and tell you what I mean by these. Moral perception is not perception through the eyes. Moral perception is through the heart. The certain the ability to have certain pro-social emotions or emotional reactions, the moral emotions, to be able to feel empathy for somebody who is in trouble, to feel sympathy for that person, to be able to empathize with their pain and then feel sympathy for that pain or compassion, to feel guilt when you do something wrong, or indignation when you see somebody else doing something wrong, to be able to feel shame when you're a bad sort of person, or contempt for others, and to be sensitive to praise and blame. These are certain emotional capacities that are necessary for a moral agent. A moral agent also needs certain practical abilities, practical rationality, practical cognitive skills. A moral agent needs to be able to understand cause and effects and understand ethical concepts in order to make ethical decisions. The agent has to be able to plan, has to be able to form and carry out an intention, and in particular the agent has to have a certain degree of moral autonomy. This is going to be a crucial concept in what we're talking about in what follows. Moral autonomy is the ability to freely apply ethical reasoning to oneself, to do it in an unconstrained way, to not be manipulated or forced or whatever to do something, but be able to look at moral principles or do moral calculations and decide for oneself what to do. And this sort of moral autonomy requires a responsiveness to ethical reasons. And the types of ethical reasons are going to vary with the types of ethical theory. We've got different ethical theories. Virtue ethics, you're going to have to be able to develop your character. To do feminist ethics, you're going to have to have a certain sensitivity to and a responsiveness to interpersonal relationships. To do the principle-based ethics, you're going to have to be able to apply abstract principles to your own conduct, to be able to see when you're being fair and when you're not, or when you're being respecting rights and when you're not. To apply rights-based thinking, you're going to have to understand the notion of a correlative duty and understand what rights people have and what it means to respect those rights. To think in a just mode, you're going to have a sense of justice and fairness. And of course, to be a utilitarian, you're going to have to do a lot of calculating. You're going to have to be able to calculate net benefits, the aggregate net benefits that you're going to cause. So these are all the sorts of ethical reasoning that you have to be responsive to. And since we're mostly going to be thinking in terms of all of these, I'm not teaching you to be a utilitarian and do only utilitarian thinking. I'm saying that to be a full ethical agent, you have to have all of these cognitive skills that are mentioned here. So, who is a moral agent? Well, I'm assuming you and I are. We're adults. We have that set of moral emotions. Maybe if you happen to be a psychopath or something, perhaps you're lacking empathy, and maybe that makes you less skilled in some of this, but I'm hoping you're not. We all have various degrees of empathy, compassion, the ability to feel guilt, shame, etc., etc. So adults have this. We have the cognitive skills to make decisions. We can apply principles to ourselves, and we can think about our character or think about our relationships, or we can do the sorts of calculations that are required. So adults we're the paradigm here. This is us. Okay? We're all adults. Children probably are lacking some of these skills. Children often have, from fairly early age, they have degrees of moral perception. Maybe 2-year-olds don't have a lot of empathy, but most of them have a fair amount of empathy and feel guilt, etc., etc. But they probably lack decision-making ability, the ability to plan and to apply moral principles. Infants, of course, can do none of this. People who are in comas can do none of these things. Animals, well, some of the higher animals may have some forms of moral perception. It's not totally clear. Chimpanzees, dolphins, and so on. But probably they lack the ability to do this forms of reasoning that are involved in these two things here, decision-making and ethical reasoning. an interesting question in business ethics is whether business corporations are moral agents. And this is going to, well, it depends on whether you're willing to accept a certain amount of vicarious sensitivity and responsiveness. If a company is owned by and run by the one person, then, well, the company is going to depend on the psychological capacities of the owner, the sensitivities, the responsiveness to reasons, and the decision making. So that's not a problem. But think of an intermediate stage. What about a committee? Committees are wholes that are not actually human beings. Committees don't feel guilt normally, and maybe metaphorically, but not. But they do have members, and those members are all adult humans, and those members do have the various degrees of moral sensitivity. So the committee can have vicarious moral sensitivity. Just as a business corporation cannot act by itself because it's a legal fiction, but it can act vicariously through its employees and officers. Committees and corporations as well, both of them, who have employees and governing committees and shareholders, et cetera, can be sensitive to moral issues through the human beings who make them up. Similarly with the responsiveness to ethical reasons. They can be responsive through the human beings that make up the committee, or the members of the committee, or they can be responsive to ethical reasons through the individuals who are involved in the governance of the corporation. So, just this isn't a real psychological ability, but it is a vicarious psychological ability. And just as they can act vicariously through their employees, they can plan or be agents through their employees. And another big difference too in these is that the decision making in a committee is often holistic. It's not done by one person. There's no one person that can be held responsible. There's a whole. Everybody votes, and if the committee works on Robert's Rules of Order, then you can frequently have situations where no individual member can influence the decision of the committee. We talked about that when we talked about causal responsibility in committee meetings. So there's a certain sort of holistic decision making that goes on in corporations and committees. All right, think about this for a second. Which of the following best example of a violation of moral autonomy? We're looking for a violation of moral autonomy. Pause the video for a moment and think about these possible answers here. Okay, moral autonomy is a feature of moral agents. It's the ability to freely apply moral principles, moral reasoning to oneself and govern oneself by moral principles or moral reasons or moral calculations. It has to be freely applied. Okay, so if the application is not free, then it's a violation of moral autonomy. Okay, the teenagers resist the television clothing commercials and create their own style of dressing. Well, this isn't a moral problem. This is an example of personal autonomy, and it's not a violation because they've resisted the potential violation. Okay, so this is not the answer. The security guard physically prevents the employee from leaving the premises. Moral autonomy is about decision making. It's not about whether you can actually carry out the decision. So physically preventing somebody is not really violating their autonomy. It's violating their liberty perhaps, but it's not violating their autonomy. The mafiosa uses threats to force the business owner to defraud his suppliers. Now we're getting closer here. There's something wrong. Something wrong has happened. The business owner has done it, but the business owner has not done it freely because the business owner has decided to defraud his suppliers because of the coercive threats of the mafiosa. So this is the sort of thing that violates moral autonomy. And the final answer, the company creates an effective firewall around its digital information systems. Well, that's an attempt to keep the information private. So that's not what we're talking about. The answer here is C. Okay, so that was an introduction to this notion of moral agency, what's involved in being a moral agent, and what this interesting problem of whether we should hold moral business corporations to be moral agents, or whether just only the people within them are moral agents.